Okay, let's unpack this. That wave of warmth and spice that hits you the second you walk into a bakery, or maybe even just the thought of it, the cinnamon bun.
Definitely.
That swirl of soft dough wrapped around a sweet, fragrant ribbon, maybe with a glistening glaze or crunchy sugar on top. You've got a memory connected to that, right?
A lazy Sunday, a special treat.
Oh, absolutely. Most people do, I think.
But have you ever stopped to really think about where this iconic bake even came from? Who actually invented it?
It's a deceptively simple question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, wonderfully complex. As you hinted, it's far more than just one person having a brilliant idea one afternoon.
Right.
For something so universally enjoyed, its origins are surprisingly intertwined with global trade, huge cultural shifts, and really centuries of baking evolution.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've really immersed ourselves in some fascinating material. I mean, everything from ancient spice routes to very specific regional baking traditions and even a few economic shifts along the way.
So our mission isn't really to pinpoint a single aha moment of invention, but more to trace the captivating journey and understand the cultural weight this pastry has gathered over time.
Precisely. Think of it less as a sudden creation and more like a delicious, slow burn of innovation building over centuries.
A slow burn. I like that metaphor.
And for you, our listener, who wants to get informed efficiently, enjoyably, we've structured this to deliver those satisfying aha moments without feeling like you're, studying for an exam.
Yeah, definitely not homework.
Prepare for some surprising twists and turns in this sweet story, though.
Okay, so where do we even begin to peel back the layers of this pastry puzzle?
Well, logically, our exploration starts right at the source, the very spice that defines it. Cinnamon.
Makes sense.
From there, we'll journey through the earliest forms of sweetened breads. Then we'll delve into the strong claims and distinct styles of the Nordic and Germanic countries, touch on some influential pastries that paved the way, and finally, look at the factors that propelled the modern cinnamon bun to, well, global stardom.
Sounds like a delectable historical itinerary.
Let's hope so. So, starting with cinnamon itself. What's truly fascinating here isn't just that it tastes good, but the incredible journey it took to even reach European kitchens in the first place.
Right, because it didn't just appear, did it? Cinnamon first arrived in Europe thanks to Roman spice traders, and incredibly, it originated all the way in Sri Lanka.
Exactly, thousands of miles away.
And for centuries, this wasn't just a flavoring, it was a powerful symbol. You have to think of it representing wealth. It was used in medicine and even as a preservative.
Absolutely. Consider the logistics, getting it from Sri Lanka to Europe in Roman times. It traveled along routes like the Silk Road, passing through countless hands, each adding to its cost.
So incredibly expensive.
Oh, unbelievably so. This multi-layered trade network meant it was a true luxury item, primarily accessible only to the very wealthy or reserved for the most special occasions in medieval Europe. That exorbitant cost really underscores its value back then.
And then things got political, right? For over a century, starting in the early 1500s, the Portuguese wrestled control of the cinnamon trade from Sri Lanka.
And then the Dutch after them.
Followed by the Dutch and then the English. It's almost mind-boggling to think about these huge global power shifts being driven in part by a spice we now, casually sprinkle on our breakfast toast.
It truly highlights its historical and economic significance. But crucially for our cinnamon bun story, as these European powers established more direct trade routes and the market became, let's say, less monopolized, the price gradually decreased. By the late 1700s, it was becoming more affordable.
So accessibility is key.
Exactly. This increased affordability and availability was a pivotal moment. It allowed cinnamon to transition from this exotic, almost mythical luxury to a more common ingredient in European cooking.
Okay, so the key ingredient is becoming more accessible. What comes next in our story? Are people immediately making cinnamon buns?
Not quite like we know them today. But, well, even before we see anything resembling the coiled cinnamon bun, Europe had a long and evolving tradition of spiced sweetbreads.
Okay.
If we look back to the Middle Ages, we find evidence of various spiced sweet rolls and enriched breads. And interestingly, monasteries often played a key role in these early developments, particularly for religious festivals.
Monks as pastry pioneers.
Yeah.
That's a fun fact. So what sort of things were they baking back then? Were they spiced?
Some were. Historical records suggest that the wealthy might have enjoyed fine white bread buns enriched with ingredients like currants or raisins. You could almost think of it as a very early ancestor to the brioche.
Okay, rich ingredients.
Definitely. Simultaneously, we see the evolution of honey cakes, like the lakash introduced to Central and Eastern Europe by Italian Jews. Over time, these cakes became more complex, incorporating ground nuts, candied citrus, and significantly for our story, spices like cinnamon and cloves.
So the spices are creeping in.
They are. It shows this gradual culinary movement towards incorporating these once precious spices beyond just their medicinal uses, actually using them for flavor.
So these early sweet treats were starting to get a bit of that spicy character we associate with the bun.
Exactly. And if we look at Germany, this trend developed even further with Lebkuchen, or gingerbread.
Yeah.
By the later Middle Ages, that had become a much more complex and heavily spiced pastry.
Right, gingerbread has deep roots.
It does. And it demonstrates that long before the coiled bun, there was a growing appreciation and expertise in using spices in baked goods across Europe.
Okay, so we have cinnamon becoming more available, and this established tradition of spiced sweetbreads. But what about the actual baking techniques? Surely you couldn't create a delicate, layered bun with the methods they had centuries ago.
That's an absolutely critical point. The mastery of yeast-leavened doughs wasn't an overnight thing. It was a centuries-long process of refinement. Understanding yeast, fermentation.
Trial and error, presumably.
A lot of trial and error, yes. And then consider the ingredients themselves. Refined wheat flour and sugar, things we see as basic staples, now were once serious luxuries.
Right, not everyday items at all.
Not for most people. Plus, the increasing availability of fats like butter played a vital role in creating richer, more tender doughs.
So all these fundamental elements that we now take for granted, good flour, affordable sugar, butter, reliable yeast, they all had to become widespread before something like the modern cinnamon bun could truly emerge.
Precisely. You need both the right building blocks, the ingredients, and the techniques to put them together effectively. It all had to come together.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now let's move to the region where the cinnamon bun, as we largely recognize it today, really begins to take shape. Northern Europe, specifically the Nordic and Germanic countries.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you think of cinnamon buns, a few countries immediately spring to mind, each with their own strong claims and distinct versions, right? Let's start with Sweden and their undeniably iconic candle bowl.
Absolutely. Sweden holds a very prominent and, you could argue, a central place in the modern story of the cinnamon bun. What's quite telling is that its widespread emergence is largely dated to the 1920s.
The 1920s, so after World War I.
Exactly, which is maybe a bit later than some people might guess.
Yeah, I might have thought earlier.
Right.
What was it about the 1920s that made it the right time?
Well, the First World War had a profound impact on food supplies across Europe. Basic ingredients like flour, sugar, butter, and, crucially for us, cinnamon were heavily rationed.
Right, scarcity was a huge issue.
Immense. So once the war ended and these restrictions were lifted, these ingredients suddenly became more affordable and accessible to everyday Swedes, not just the wealthy elite. This newfound access really fueled a boom in home baking and consequently the popularity of treats like the cannel bowl.
So it was almost like a celebratory post-war indulgence, a taste of normalcy returning.
In a way, yes, I think that's part of it. And while it began to appear in the 20s, the cannel bowl truly ascended to national icon status in the 1950s.
The 50s.
Yes, this was a period of increasing prosperity in Sweden, often referred to as glada 50-talet, the happy 50s. It really solidified its place as the beloved pastry of the country during that boom time.
And it's so deeply intertwined with their culture, especially with the tradition of fika, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. Fika is far more than just a coffee break in Sweden. It's a core social ritual, a designated moment to pause, connect with others, friends, family, colleagues.
It's institutionalized relaxation time.
Pretty much. And the cannel bowl is almost invariably part of that picture. It's a tangible representation of that social connection, that moment of enjoyment. Some estimates suggest the average Swede consumes the equivalent of over 300 cinnamon buns every single year.
300? That's a staggering number of cinnamon buns.
It really is. It shows you how central it is.
And they even have a dedicated National Cinnamon Bun Day, right?
They do. Knellbollens Dag on October 4th. It was established relatively recently in 1999 by the Hembakningsrådet, the Home Baking Council, and it's a massive annual celebration. It not only boosts bakery sales hugely, but it also encourages home baking and further cements its cultural importance.
And what makes the Swedish cannel bowl distinctive?
Well, a key characteristic is often the subtle hint of cardamom in the dough itself, which adds a lovely aromatic complexity. And typically it's topped with crunchy pearl sugar, usually no icing like you see in the US.
Okay, cardamom and pearl sugar. Got it. So Sweden has a very strong claim, especially for popularizing the modern bun in the 20th century and making it such a cultural touchstone. But what about Norway? I've heard their Skillingsbowl might have an even longer history.
Norway's Skillingsbowl does indeed have a reputation for a significantly longer history. The story goes that its origins in the city of Bergen could potentially stretch back over 500 years, maybe to the 16th century.
Wow, 500 years. That's a considerable difference in timeline compared to the Swedish 1920s emergence. What's the historical context there?
Well, the history of the Skillingsbowl is closely linked to the Hanseatic League.
Ah, the powerful trading network.
Exactly, that incredibly powerful medieval trading confederation. Bergen was a major Hanseatic port, a hub of activity. And the prevailing theory is that German bakers, who were a significant part of this influential community in Bergen, introduced a popular German pastry.
Right.
This pastry then adapted and evolved over centuries within Bergen, eventually becoming the Skillingsbowl we know. So it's believed to be a culinary import that became thoroughly Norwegian over time.
So essentially a German pastry that found a new home and identity in Norway through trade.
That's the widely accepted narrative, yes. The name itself, Skillingsbowl, even reflects its history. It's derived from its original price, 1 Norwegian skilling, which was a former unit of currency.
Named after its price.
Exactly. Originally, they also apparently contained raisins, although those largely disappeared during the rationing of World War II and haven't typically returned to the common recipe today.
Fascinating. It's a great example of how trade, migration, and even major historical events like wars can shape culinary traditions.
Absolutely. It really illustrates that food history isn't static.
Interesting. Okay, so Germany seems to be a recurring influence in this story already. What about Denmark and their Kanelsnegl?
Denmark's Kanelsnegl, which literally translates to cinnamon snail, is another integral part of their rich culinary heritage. And of course, Danish traders themselves were instrumental historically in bringing spices like cinnamon from Asia to Europe.
Right, they're major players in that trade.
Definitely. Their version, the Kanelsnegl, often features a dough that's perhaps a bit less sweet compared to some others, but typically with a very generous swirl of cinnamon filling. You'll also find variations that use puff pastry for added flakiness, which links into their broader pastry tradition.
And how does the Kanelsnegl fit into Danish culture? Is it linked to something like fika?
It's deeply associated with the Danish concept of hygge.
Ah, hygge, the coziness concept.
Exactly, that feeling of coziness, warmth, contentment, enjoying simple pleasures. The Kanelsnegl fits perfectly into that idea, and they have a charming modern tradition called Onsdagsnegl, the Wednesday snail.
Wednesday snail.
Yes. It's typically an extra-large version that gained popularity in the 1990s. The reasons aren't totally clear, maybe a midweek treat, some link it to people grabbing one after local football games, but it's become a fun tradition.
That's brilliant.
And it's also worth noting the broader context of Danish pastry generally, or Wienerbrød. That actually has Austrian roots, believe it or not, stemming from bakery worker strikes in Denmark back in the 1850s when Austrian bakers were brought in.
Austrian roots for Danish pastry.
Yeah. So while not all Kanelsnegl use that same laminated dough, it shows the diverse pastry influences within Denmark. There's even an interesting footnote about EU regulations on coumarin, a compound found in some types of cinnamon, and Denmark getting an exemption for traditional pastries like the Kanelsnegl, which really highlights its cultural significance. They fought to keep making it their traditional way.
Wow, okay, so a lot of cinnamon pastry love across Scandinavia, each with its own unique flavor, story, and cultural connection. What about Finland and the Korvapusti? That name always makes me smile.
It's wonderfully evocative, isn't it? Slapped ear. Or Urfil in Swedish Finnish, which means the same thing. It perfectly describes its distinctive shape, sort of flattened on the side.
It really does.
Versions of the Korvapusti are believed to have been part of Finnish culinary life since at least the 18th century. Again, like Norway's bun, there's likely a German connection, possibly arriving via Sweden. Some even speculate a link to the German Franzbrötchen we'll talk about.
Yeah, the German link.
Seems to be a theme. But similar to Sweden, its widespread popularity really took off in Finland after World War II.
That post-war period seems to be a real turning point for these kinds of treats across the board.
It really does. It's about ingredient availability again. with increased access to key baking ingredients like sugar and wheat, and also a significant improvement in the quality of Finnish-grown wheat, specifically in the 1950s, it just became much more accessible and, frankly, more delicious to make.
Better ingredients make better buns.
Exactly. In terms of ingredients, it shares similarities with the Swedish kanelbulle. It often features cardamom in the dough and is usually topped with pearl sugar.
Cardamom and pearl sugar again.
And it plays a central role in the Finnish tradition of pullakavit, which is essentially their version of fika coffee enjoyed with a sweet bun, often a korvapusti.
So a similar social ritual.
Very similar. And they also enthusiastically celebrate Cinnamon Bun Day, korvapusti päivä, on October 4th, sharing the day with Sweden. It really emphasizes that interconnected Nordic culinary heritage.
It really paints a picture of a shared Nordic affection for this type of spiced pastry, but with unique national expressions. That brings us more directly to Germany itself then, with their Zimtschnecken and the intriguing Franzbrötchens.
Right. The Zimtschnecke literally translates to cinnamon snail, just like the Danish one. And it's the more general German version, a spiral of dough filled with cinnamon and sugar, sometimes with raisins added in.
Pretty classic.
Yes. But what's particularly interesting is the longer history of German Schnecken snail-shaped buns in general. These often weren't heavily spiced, sometimes just sweetened with sugar or maybe currants.
Okay.
And crucially, German settlers actually brought these Schnecken traditions with them when they immigrated to the United States, particularly Pennsylvania, back in the 18th century. And these Schnecken are considered direct ancestors of the much-loved Pennsylvania Dutch sticky buns.
Wow, that's a direct and maybe unexpected link to American baking. I wouldn't have immediately connected those.
It's quite a clear lineage when you trace it back. Now, the Franzbrötchen is a bit different. That sounds quite specific to a certain region, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Franz suggests French.
Exactly. The Franzbrötchen is really a specialty of northern Germany, particularly the city of Hamburg. Its origin story is quite unique and is believed to be linked directly to the French Napoleonic occupation of Hamburg in the early 1800s, between 1806 and 1814.
Okay, so a connection to Napoleon's troops.
That's the story. The name itself, which translates roughly to French roll, strongly suggests a French pastry inspiration, most likely the croissant, which was becoming popular then.
Right.
The local legend recounts a Hamburg baker attempting to bake this new French bread, Franzbrot, maybe inspired by the occupiers, and accidentally searing it in fat, perhaps flattening it, thus creating the distinctive shape and texture of the Franzbrötchen.
A happy accident in the kitchen.
Possibly. A key characteristic that often sets it apart is that it frequently uses a laminated dough, Plunderteig in German, which is similar to croissant or Danish pastry dough. This gives it a distinctly flaky texture compared to a standard Zimtschnecke.
Flaky, buttery cinnamon.
Sounds good.
It is. And of course, we have to remember Germany has this incredibly long and rich baking tradition overall, going back to ancient spiced breads and, as we mentioned, the 13th century Lebkuchen, which already incorporated cinnamon. So the expertise was certainly there. So it seems like there's this fascinating family tree almost of sweet, spiced, often rolled pastries across Northern Europe, each with its own subtle variations in ingredients, shape, name, and a unique thread in the historical tapestry.
Precisely. It's not neat and tidy. And if you were to look at a comparative overview, you could really map out those connections and distinctions, the different names, the nuances in their origin stories, the slightly different key ingredients like cardamom or pearl sugar or icing, and their very specific cultural associations like fika or hygge.
So it clearly wasn't a singular invention in one place at one time.
Not at all. It was much more like a web of related and evolving culinary traditions spreading across the region, influencing each other.
Okay, so we've explored these strong Nordic and Germanic connections, which seem central to the modern bun. But were there any earlier pastries before these regional specialties solidified that might have been influential precursors? Any sort of ancestors in the broader European baking landscape to this coiled, sweet delight?
Definitely. We can look further back. Let's consider the German Semmel, for instance, or rather, its early history. Early Swedish Semmelor note, the plural dating back perhaps to the 15th century up through the 18th century, were surprisingly different.
How so?
They were often savory buns, maybe flavored with caraway seeds, and they actually originated in Germany. They were quite simple, sometimes just a plain bun soaked in hot milk. Very different from the sweet treat we know today.
Savory summer. Soaked in milk. That's an unexpected twist in the story. I only know the sweet Lenten bun.
It is quite a shift. The transition to the sweet semla that's now a beloved part of Swedish tradition, especially around Lent, with its cardamom spice bun, almond paste filling, and whipped cream topping that really only took hold in the early 20th century, probably between 1910 and 1930. And it was largely driven by bakeries, not home baking initially.
Ah, bakeries innovating.
Exactly. It's a great example of how a basic bread form can be adapted and utterly transformed over time, especially as new and different ingredients, like more sugar and spices, become more readily available and popular.
So the fundamental idea of a yeast-leavened bun has a long history, but the specific sweet spice version evolved much later. What about the specific coiled shape, though? Were there other coiled sweet pastries appearing elsewhere in Europe around a similar time, maybe hinting at a shared idea?
That's a good question. The British Chelsea bun is a prime example here. It emerged in 18th century London, specifically at the very popular Chelsea Bun House in West London. Apparently even royalty were fans.
The 18th century, so earlier than the Swedish popularization.
Yes, significantly earlier in terms of widespread fame. The Chelsea bun was known for being sticky, sweet, buttery, and quite dense. It was a coiled pastry, usually filled with sugar and currants, sometimes lemon peel.
Currants, not necessarily cinnamon.
Primarily currants, though recipes varied, and some might have included mixed spice, which could contain cinnamon. It's generally considered a direct modification of even earlier, simpler currant bun recipes. But its existence and its coiled shape definitely suggests a broader European trend towards these kinds of sweet, rolled pastries developing around a similar period, even if the fillings varied.
So the idea of a sweet, rolled-up dough wasn't solely a Nordic or a Germanic invention, even if they perfected the cinnamon version.
Exactly. And if we look further back within Germany itself, beyond the Schnecken, you have the incredibly long tradition of Stollen.
The Christmas bread.
The famous Christmas bread, yes. Its origins stretch way back to the 14th century, but it evolved significantly over time. Initially, it was a relatively austere Lenten bread, quite plain.
Lenten? I thought it was rich.
It became rich. By the 16th century, especially in places like Dresden, it transformed. This was thanks in part to a papal dispensation known as the Butter Brief, the Butter Letter, in 1490.
A letter about butter from the Pope.
Essentially, yes. It allowed the use of butter instead of oil during Advent. This later Stollen became packed with butter, sugar, and increasingly exotic spices like cinnamon and cardamom, along with candied fruits, nuts, maybe marzipan.
That sounds more like the Stoleno.
Right. And this demonstrates a deep-rooted German expertise in complex spice baking going back centuries, providing a really significant culinary foundation. And the Bremer Klubben, a northern German variation of Stollen from the mid-16th century, further emphasizes this tradition. Again, like the Skillingsbowlink, it benefited from the increased availability of spices through the Hanseatic trade network.
So it's like there was this rich and evolving tradition of spiced sweet baking across Europe, especially Germany, for a long time. And the cinnamon bun, in its various forms, eventually emerged from that broader and very diverse culinary landscape. It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Precisely. It had precursors, cousins, and a whole lot of shared DNA, you could say.
Okay, that makes the picture much clearer.
Hmm.
Now let's turn our attention to why the cinnamon bun, particularly in its more modern forms like the cannibal or even the American roll, achieved such widespread and enduring popularity. What were the key factors that really propelled it to this level of global affection?
That's the million-dollar question, or perhaps the million-bun question, as you said. What really made it take off and stay so popular?
Yeah.
Well, a huge factor, as we touched on with Sweden and Finland, was that post-World War II era and the dramatically increased accessibility of key baking ingredients.
Right, the end of rationing.
Exactly. During both World War I and II, essential things like flour, sugar, butter, spices, they were subject to strict rationing across much of Europe. Once the wars ended and economies slowly began to recover, these ingredients became much more affordable and readily available to the general public, not just the elite.
Democratization of ingredients, almost.
That's a great way to put it. This surge in availability allowed pastries like the Swedish kannelbulle and the Finnish korvapusti to transition from being occasional special treats to potentially everyday pleasures. And it also fueled a huge resurgence in home baking traditions as people finally had the means. The improved quality of Finnish-grown wheat in the 1950s also played a specific practical role in the success of the korvapusti there.
So it was partly about more people simply being able to afford the necessary ingredients and having better quality ingredients to bake them at home or buy them more cheaply.
Exactly right. Economics plays a huge role in food trends. And then, layered on top of that, you have the profound power of those cultural rituals we discussed.
Fika, hygge, pulakavit.
Precisely. The Swedish fika, the Danish hygge, the Finnish pulakavit, these deeply ingrained social customs, where the cinnamon bun, in its local form, often takes center stage, they significantly elevate its cultural significance. It becomes far more than just a food item.
Yeah, it's symbolic.
It's an integral part of shared social experiences, moments of connection, and even national identity.
It's the edible centerpiece of these cherished social moments. It represents something more than just flour and sugar.
Absolutely. And we can't overlook the role of industry and, well, strategic promotion in maintaining that status.
Marketing comes in.
It does. The Swedish Home Baking Council's creation of National Cinnamon Bun Day back in 1999 is a perfect illustration of this. It wasn't just a whim, it was a targeted effort.
And presumably it worked.
Hugely. It demonstrably boosts sales for bakeries every year, it encourages home baking, which keeps the tradition alive, and it further reinforces the Kennelbowl's cultural importance. The fact that Finland has adopted the same day for their Korvapuusti really highlights the success and reach of such initiatives. It keeps it front of mind.
So it's this potent combination of ingrained tradition, being central to social connection, and some clever ongoing promotion that keeps it so beloved in those countries.
Precisely. A multi-pronged attack of deliciousness and cultural relevance. And finally, we need to consider its global spread and adaptation, particularly its journey to North America.
Right, because the cinnamon bun is huge here too, but maybe a bit different.
Very different. Often. Scandinavian and German immigrants naturally carried their beloved recipes with them when they moved across the Atlantic. We talked about the Pennsylvania Dutch Schnecken already. However, the cinnamon roll underwent a significant transformation in North America. It often became much larger, considerably sweeter, and frequently perhaps most iconically adorned with that generous swirl of cream cheese frosting.
Yes, the cream cheese frosting. That feels very American.
It is widely seen as the key American adaptation, yes. And it has definitely evolved into its own distinct and incredibly popular style. Philadelphia, with its early influx of German settlers and their Schnecken, played a significant role in establishing those early American cinnamon bun traditions.
And then came the chains.
And then came the chains. With the rise of large commercial bakery chains like Cinnabon, which was founded in 1985, this supersized, very sweet, often heavily iced Americanized style has, for many people globally, become the defining image of what a cinnamon bun is.
Right. For many, that is the cinnamon bun.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how globalization can reshape perceptions of what constitutes an authentic version of a particular food. The American version is now exported back around the world.
So after this truly deep dive, wading through centuries of spice trade, baking evolution, and cultural traditions, it's abundantly clear, isn't it? There's no single inventor we can point to and thank for the cinnamon bun.
No, definitely not. It's been a long, incredibly delicious journey, really, weaving across numerous cultures and spanning centuries.
Yeah.
We've traced the evolution from those early spice breads, highlighted the pivotal role of the Nordic and Germanic regions in shaping the modern forms, seen the undeniable influence of global trade, economics, and migration, and finally looked at the various factors, cultural, commercial, practical, that have cemented its widespread modern popularity.
It's a story as rich and layered, you could say, as the pastry itself.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So, for you listening, maybe take a moment to consider this. Knowing this intricate, fascinating history behind something as seemingly simple as a cinnamon bun, how does it perhaps shift your appreciation for it the next time you bite into one? Does that super sweet cream cheese frosted American version feel, I don't know, more or less authentic now that you understand its diverse European roots and its evolution?
It's a good question to ponder. What does authentic even mean in food?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder about all the hidden histories nestled within the everyday foods we often take completely for granted. What else is hiding in plain sight on our plates?
It certainly does, and it beautifully illustrates that culinary history is so often a shared human story, full of unexpected twists, delightful turns, borrowing, adapting, and creating these enduring traditions that bring us comfort and joy.
Well, thanks for joining us on this particularly sweet and definitely enlightening historical exploration.